Oracle of Seasons is one of two Zelda games released simultaneously in 2001, the other being Oracle of Ages. The order the games are played doesn't matter too much, so I decided to start with this one. Although Seasons does focus more on combat over puzzles, it does have a healthy amount of both. After beating whichever of the two games you decide to play first, you're given a code to enter into the other game to start a linked game. Playing with this code alters the plot to follow on from the first game, as well as add some extra secrets. While playing the second game, you're given codes for the first game to unlock extra items. This is the first time a Zelda game has had any kind of post-game content, even if it is minor. The games both work fine as standalone titles, but the story does end on a cliffhanger if you never play the second game. I'll talk about the linked features in more detail next time when I cover Oracle of Ages. Oracle of Seasons uses the same engine as Link's Awakening. This causes the games to share many superficial similarities. The most obvious is the visuals. The games look similar, and Seasons reuses a lot of assets. Some of the UI panels, like the menus, have been updated, but most of the UI is unchanged. The gameplay and controls also feel identical to Link's Awakening. While this isn't a bad thing, it can make the game feel like it doesn't have its own identity at times. The focus on difficult combat also gives the game a lot in common with A Link to the Past. There's not too much that Seasons does to differentiate itself from the previous games in the series. The evolution from previous titles is probably the smallest so far. The main unique mechanic is the Seasons mechanic. Early on in the game, you gain access to the Rod of Seasons and the ability to change the season to winter. More seasons are unlocked as you progress through the game, and each have special effects. In winter, some water turns to ice. Some trees lose their leaves, allowing you to walk past them. There are also build-ups of snow which can block paths and open up new ones. In autumn, some pits are covered with leaves, allowing you to walk past them. Stone mushrooms, which normally block paths, can also be picked up and removed. In spring, some rocks turn to flowers, which can be destroyed to open up new paths. There are also some bounce pads you can use to reach higher ledges. In summer, water dries up, opening new paths. Vines also cover certain cliffs, allowing you to climb up them. Although Zelda is no stranger to having alternate versions of the same places, being able to switch up the environment between 4 versions takes this to a much greater extreme. The changes that each season bring are consistent, so you're rarely stuck wondering which season you need to change to. It's a well-executed mechanic that brings variety to the game without being overbearing. In addition to being used for puzzles, each season has its own colour palette. This helps to give the game some visual flair, and it also serves a practical purpose reminding you of the current season. It's hard to forget that it's winter when there's snow everywhere. I'd like to see this mechanic revisited on a more powerful machine. The different seasons could look amazing with some visual effects and higher fidelity assets. As you'd expect, Oracle of Seasons features many returning and new items. There are some twists on the returning items, like the upgraded boomerang which you can now manually control while it's in the air. One of the bigger upgrades is to the Roc's Feather, which can be upgraded into the Roc's Cape to allow the user to glide. This upgrade significantly increases Link's mobility, as well as being useful for platforming. Being airborne allows you to dodge most attacks, which makes it a fantastic defensive tool. There are some entirely new items, like the magnet gloves, which allow for unique puzzles. There's also a new item type called seeds. When you equip one of these items, you're shown a sub-menu which allows you to pick the type of seed to use. The downside is that it takes even longer to switch items, which was already a problem in these games. The most notable of the seeds are the Pegasus and Gale seeds. The Pegasus seed allows Link to dash, which when combined with the Roc's Cape allows you to cover entire screens in a single jump. This combo allows for a freedom of movement not seen in any previous 2D Zelda game. The Gale seeds allow you to fast travel to special trees found throughout the world. The world of Holodrum is decently sized but not massive. As you unlock new items and seasons, the world will begin to open up, allowing access to new locations as well as quicker routes between old locations. The progression is mostly linear outside of 2 dungeons which can be done in either order depending on which season you unlock first. In certain areas of the overworld you can summon your animal companion. There are 3 in total and they all have different movement options. The mechanic felt a little underutilised to me. I never really found a good reason to use a companion in a spot where it wasn't 100% required. Although there are 3 companions, you only gain access to a single one for the majority of the game. This is determined by which flute you acquire first, and is generally not signposted, so you can't really know which companion you'll get on your first time through. I ended up with Ricky, who from my understanding is one of the better ones. The overworld is well designed and enjoyable to navigate, but it doesn't do anything particularly new that the series hasn't done before. In other words, it's more of the same. There is however a second smaller world which is much more interesting. Subrosia is a second world accessed by warp points found throughout the overworld. At first, you only gain access to a small portion of this world, but as you progress and find more warp points, Subrosia opens up. Although it is a small map, it does have a lot of content. The unique terrain gives the world a different feel to anything we've seen before in the series. It has its own currency and characters, which helps to distinguish it as being distinct from Holodrum. It also contains the Temple of Seasons, which is where you upgrade the Rod of Seasons. The addition of Subrosia provides a twist on the otherwise generic feeling Overworld. Both Subrosia and the main world are filled with collectibles and optional content. There is a trading sequence. This time around it is optional, but the reward is significant, especially given the game's difficulty. Seashells don't return from Link's Awakening. Instead, this game has rings. Through completing side content and exploring the world, you'll gain access to a variety of rings. Wearing a ring gives you a unique special effect. This system allows for some nice customization of gameplay. Unfortunately, many of the rings are either too niche to be useful or outright useless. This made the rings feel unrewarding to collect. Sometimes you will get something useful, but most of the time the ring will sit unused for the entire game. Despite my feelings about the rings, I still found hunting for collectibles rewarding. The difficult combat in this game makes pieces of heart more important, which in turn makes exploration more valuable. In Link's Awakening, a piece of heart never felt like a big reward because death was rare. In this game, going out of my way to get more health always felt worthwhile. As I've already mentioned, combat is one of the major focuses of this game. There haven't been any major changes to the combat mechanics, but the combat in this game gets hard towards the end. There's a good variety of enemy types. Every enemy requires a different strategy to defeat, and there aren't any that feel redundant. Combat encounters almost always feature multiple enemies. They also often include environmental hazards. Through combining enemy types and terrain features, Seasons manages to keep the combat both fresh and challenging without feeling cheap. Like the Zelda games before Awakening, dungeons are gauntlets of combat encounters where death is a real concern. There are still challenging puzzles, but the main progression blocker is usually combat. In terms of actual additions to combat, these are kept to a minimum. The biggest addition is probably the Rock's Cape, which can provide extended airtime to simultaneously dodge attacks and reposition. A decent chunk of the items are useful in combat this time around, which allows for some variety in playstyle. While the combat in Seasons isn't radically different to anything in the previous games, I do appreciate the return to the kind of difficulty found in the first 3 games. The bosses in Seasons were one of the high points for me. There's a nice mix of puzzle-based bosses as well as pure combat challenges. Even some of the more puzzle-focused bosses still require some execution to defeat once you figure out the strategy. Returning bosses like the dragon from Zelda 1 work well with the new focus on combat. My favourite boss in this game is the Po Sisters mini-boss. This boss has an alternate lose condition where you need to keep lighting fires in the room or you're sent back to the entrance of the dungeon. Although the boss fight isn't particularly challenging, I enjoyed having a way to lose outside of just running out of health. I'd like to see more experimental bosses like this. One sour note for me was the final boss. The final phase of the boss uses the 2D side-scrolling gameplay. Outside of the second Zelda game, I've never found the side-scrolling sections to work particularly well. They're fine to break up the gameplay, but I find the controls to be stiff and clunky. The game ending with a difficult boss fight using these controls was disappointing, especially compared to some of the other final bosses in the series. The dungeons in Seasons are consistently well designed. They're suitably complex and dangerous without feeling overwhelming. There's a return to combat gauntlets and attrition providing challenge outside of the puzzles. While there is a good number of dungeons in this game, most of them don't have clear gimmicks to set them apart, which can make them all blend together. That said, there were some memorable sections. An example is the Sword and Shield dungeon, where you need to clear a lava pit by dropping ice through pits. Despite the focus on combat, Seasons is still full of unique puzzles. The Magnet Glove puzzles require precise timing in a way not often seen in the 2D Zelda games. There's a mix of new and reused puzzles, but even when puzzles are reused, they're often changed in some way. An example of this is a puzzle based on the Lost Woods maze in Zelda 1. This time around you also need to change to the correct season as well as following the correct paths. If you prefer the puzzle solving elements of Zelda games, Oracle of Seasons will not disappoint even if that's not necessarily the focus. With Awakening, Ocarina and Majora's, it seemed like the direction of the series was moving towards telling interesting stories with a heavy focus on tone. Seasons is a return to the first 3 Zelda games in this regard. While there is a story, it's the standard save the princess by collecting MacGuffins. Like the early Zelda games, the story is minimal enough to where it doesn't interfere with the rest of the game. I don't have much else to say about the story, it's fine for what it is. Oracle of Seasons features a mix of old and new music. Most of the new music is good and fits in with the style of the older Zelda games. The highlights for me were the dungeon themes, which suitably ramp up in intensity throughout the game while still providing atmosphere. Most of the other music in the game is good, but I felt there wasn't many standout tracks. There's also a variety of returning songs in this game. The one that stood out to me was a chiptune arrangement of the Song of Storms, which really made me smile. It's a great arrangement of a fantastic song and probably my favourite track on the OST. While the new music doesn't quite reach the heights of the rest of the series, it's still a good soundtrack. Oracle of Seasons is a solid 2D Zelda game without many flaws. It has tight gameplay and is enjoyable throughout. It suffers somewhat from being just another 2D Zelda game on a console that already had a fantastic entry. There isn't much new here, it's just a straightforward 2D Zelda game. While it doesn't quite reach the heights of A Link to the Past, it's still hard to find many meaningful issues with Oracle of Seasons. In the next episode of the Evolution of Zelda, I'll be covering Oracle of Ages, the other Oracle game. I'll also be covering the linked features that connect the two games. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe and I'll see you in the next episode.